Hello. Thank you for joining us today for this press conference. My name is Maya Dorwaz. I am a media officer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, covering special procedures media outreach. And this press conference is held by the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other inhuman treatment, Dr. Alice Edwards. I will give her the floor to give us a few opening remarks, and then we will open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for turning up to this press conference. Yesterday I delivered my first report to the Human Rights Council here in Geneva with the focus on looking at good practices and the challenges around legislation for the investigation of crimes of torture. As I recounted that since starting in this position, in my first half year in the position has been characterised by escalating incidents of torture and inhuman treatment in many countries. I've been inundated with requests to intervene on behalf of alleged victims. In the 12 months from January to December 2022, the mandate, including my predecessor, submitted 72 communications to 44 different governments, noting that there was a 6-month gap between appointments. The real number is probably double that, and also, of course, limited by resource constraints. In that regard, I wanted to mention 3 specific cases that I've been following. One is of the Nobel Prize winner Ales Bialiatski of Belarus and his colleagues who have been now sentenced. In Turkey, Şebnem Finaci, who is one of the architects of the Istanbul Protocol on the investigation and documentation of torture, who has been sentenced to over 2 years in prison for speaking out to the government, and of course the wide range of cases in relation to the Iranian women's movement, and also the 100 persons that are currently on death row as a consequence. I've been following up on a range of other cases, and I'll leave that to the question and answer session. But in terms of my thematic report, I wanted to focus on the duty to investigate the crime of torture, as I have found that this is universally under-implemented obligation of states. And related to that, of course, is putting in place an appropriate legislative framework, a crime of torture itself, as well as independent prosecutions and sentences that are in alignment with the gravity of the offence. The reason for looking at national investigations as the primary responders is because the scale and scope of crimes of torture being perpetrated every day, it will never be enough for reliance by the international community on international mechanisms, no matter how active and important those mechanisms may be. And although we should certainly be using all mechanisms and avenues at our disposal, it is important that there is local accountability also for healing, reconciliation amongst people in societies. I made a comment yesterday that when a state fails to defend truth and justice, it becomes an accomplice in torture. I wanted to tackle the perception that a number of governments have that launching criminal investigations into torture is seen to threaten or undermine their legitimacy, and so that leads to cover-ups, witness tampering, intimidation and reprisals against both victims as well as whistleblowers. And on the contrary, what really threatens governmental legitimacy is impunity. Investigating torture is an important function of a rights-based and open society. Failing to do so has all the hallmarks of a closed society. The report sets out a whole range of challenges from the institutional and structural through to the legal, cultural and practical, and it also gives examples of how they can be tackled, drawing on practice of states themselves. I did want to mention to you in this briefing that I've counted 105 countries that have an explicit crime of torture in their national law, and that is an encouraging trajectory. Of course, not all of those laws are in full alignment with the Convention Against Torture, but there is room, and there is room for improvement. I also noted in this research that there are a number of countries that continue to have torture within torture within statute books that makes it lawful, such as allowing indefinite solitary confinement or corporal punishment, as well as permitting torture or ill treatment or other similar forms to force or extract information or a confession. And containing those laws in national legislation means that those types of incidents are unprosecutable. So I've called for those laws to be repealed immediately. I spent a lot of the report on looking at the particular situation of victims and survivors of the crime of torture, and what I emphasised to the states that because of the power asymmetry between the public official and the victim, the public official in this case, as opposed to ordinary criminal circumstances, being both the state that's going to take action against the perpetrator, but also the perpetrator itself. And that situation of particular precarity requires some rebalancing, and the main recommendation of the report is for states to equip, enable and empower independent investigative bodies and officials to operate promptly and with the necessary urgency, and that requires that they be hierarchically, administratively and financially separate from the broader administration. And I think on that note, I'll leave it there, and I'm open for questions either on the report or on broader issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. So we will open questions from the room first, if there are any. No. So we will quickly move to those on Zoom. Please state your name and the agency you work for. We will take one question at a time. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Fiancon-Bokonga. I'm on Zoom, and I'd like to ask you what kind of initiative or advice do you have to react or to react or to help the victims and the survivors of torture. We know that many people have been victims due to torture made by United States, abroad of United States, and also other countries are not doing it on their national territory, but they're proceeding to torture outside of the national territory. How do you see these kind of situations? Do you have advices and recommendations about that towards the victims, and also regarding the national legislation? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for the question. The question of what can we do and what can states do in terms of victims and survivors is a very important one. The first is to make them central to the design of any proceedings relating to crimes of torture, from having legislative role within those procedures. Some states have incorporated victims as an active party within the proceedings, so they have a special role to play. Other states, for example, have allowed victims to follow the proceedings, to be engaged with investigators. Others assign victim liaison officers that can help them through the procedure. And also those people would be available to family members of victims, for example, in the context of persons who have disappeared. So the report does actually capture quite a number of good practices that states themselves have developed, either generally in the criminal justice system or more specifically for this context of victims of torture. One of the most important thing is that, and we say this a lot, but victims need to be treated with due respect. And this includes before, during and after legal proceedings, and that they have the right to rehabilitation, which is a right in Article 14 of the Convention Against Torture, and they have this right regardless of legal proceedings. So the report emphasises that, in fact, treating the mental health of victims of and survivors of torture is not only incredibly important for their own well-being, but also it helps them become more reliable witnesses in court proceedings should they wish to do so. So kind of orienting the proceedings around the victim is an important step in that regard.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have a follow-up question from...
Yes, I do have a follow-up regarding countries that are in fact torturing people abroad, not on the national territory. We know that there have been several cases. So what do you advise victims, how victims could proceed, how could they defend their rights to be treated with respect, and this treatment to be recognized as being happened? Because we know that when it does not happen on the national territory, some countries say, no, it did not happen on the territory, so it is not under the national law. It's a way to escape, as you know, the legislation. So in this kind of situation, what do you advise to the victims to do? And how can the civil society help solving these kind of situations?
Thanks for the follow-up and the clarification. So, I mean, it's very important at the national level that all the heads of jurisdiction are in national law. So that would include when the crime is committed in the territory, when it's on a flag vessel ship, where the victims are nationals, where the perpetrators are nationals, or where, in fact, which is the scope of universal jurisdiction as it's known, that there is not this connection with the state in terms of the crime, but where, for example, the victims and or perpetrators may even be temporarily in their territory. I'm pleased to note that an increasing number of states have adopted this concept of universal jurisdiction, which is not new but does date to the Convention Against Torture and also obviously the Pinochet judgments back in the day. We've had a number of cases, for example, where asylum seekers living in certain Western countries have identified their perpetrator in the streets. There were cases in Belgium and in France, where the state then has launched an investigation. But it's really important that the legal basis allows for this to happen. More recently in Germany, Germany has actioned a number of cases against perpetrators against the Yazidi population in Syria and Iraq. This is an effective way. It is, according to the civil society organisations I know working on this, quite laborious. It also sometimes requires that they are tracking the movements of alleged perpetrators, so that when they do step into a country that has this ability to exercise your universal jurisdiction, that they are apprehended and an investigation is carried out.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Gabriela Sotomayor from Proceso, Mexico.
Hi, thank you very much. I apologize. I'm sorry that I was a little bit late, but I would like to ask you about Mexico. Former Special Rapporteur, Mr. Mendez, he did a very, very detailed report on Mexico. He said that torture was generalized in the country. So my question is, if you are if you see any advance in Mexico in this matter, in the torture after detention, what are your comments on that? If you plan to go to Mexico again, if you can talk a little bit about Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question, Gabriela. Unfortunately, I don't have information at hand on that. Or what's happened in the follow-up since Juan Mendez's visit to Mexico. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you up-to-date information. But you did ask about a possible visit. My visits for 2024 this year are scheduled to Ukraine and Chile.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please raise your hand if you have a question. If no further questions, would you have any other comments, Dr. Edwards? Anything to add?
Nothing to add, other than, as this is my first press conference here in Geneva, I have indicated in my General Assembly report in October that part of the mandate, as I see it, is also to raise awareness about the absolute prohibition against torture in light of some complacency around it, both in the general public as well as public authorities. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you would like comment from myself in due course. Thank you.
Thank you. So if no other questions, we will end this press conference, but don't hesitate to reach out if you have any follow-up requests or inquiries. Thank you very much.